and we're pleased to be here today to talk about asset mapping and asset mapping specifically for digital inclusion and how that's going to play into your overall community connectivity plans. So we're going to spend about the next 45, 50 minutes or so doing an overview, getting you all familiar with the concepts of asset mapping and sharing some resources that we have, some tools that we have built at NDIA specifically to help communities do asset mapping around their digital inclusion resources, understand what their ecosystem looks like, and then put that into practice in developing strategies for digital inclusion. So if we can jump to the next slide, we've got, we'll give just a quick overview of the agenda. So in a moment, we're kind of doing introductions now, but we'll finish up introductions. We'll start with an overview, kind of the key concepts of asset mapping, why it's important, and the value that we see in it, particularly for digital inclusion work. Then we'll move into some best practices for developing asset mapping, particularly for digital inclusion. And then, like I said, we'll share some of the tools that we've built and give you all a chance to start to play around with and get exposed to those. And to ask us some questions as well. So we'll try to leave as much time as possible at the end for wrap up for conversation and discussion. But as Sam said, please put your questions in the Q&A so that we can answer those kind of throughout as well. So let's, without further ado, let's introduce ourselves. Again, my name's Schill. I'm the Director of Research and Programs for NDIA. What that means is I head up our data and research work, a big part of which is developing tools and resources and guidance like asset mapping for practitioners on the ground, for local governments, nonprofit organizations, folks like yourselves that are doing this kind of work, either planning work or providing direct digital inclusion services to folks in your community. Additionally, I also head up our support for local governments, local coalitions, and other local organizations. So that's me. You'll hear a bit more from me in a moment, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Paolo to introduce himself and take us away.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. It's nice to see some familiar names, at least on this webinar from the kickoff back in September. And if I'm new to you, then it's nice to meet you. My name is Paolo Balboa. I'm a senior program manager with the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. In the second half of Aaron's introduction, where he was describing local support, that's what I focus on. So I support Aaron and the team doing local support, whether that means working with local practitioners to stand up digital inclusion programs or working directly with local governments to build digital equity strategies, one component of which is the topic of today's webinar, asset mapping. So I'm excited to get into this today. And just as a FYI, a few weeks ago, NDIA did a Digital Inclusion 101 webinar with Connect Humanity folks. The link is going into the chat now for that. I just mentioned that because usually at the top of these webinars, we like to give our definitions of digital equity and digital inclusion, but for the purposes of time and to make sure that we have time for questions at the end and maybe some meaningful discussion, we are going to move past those definition slides for now and get directly into the topic of today's webinar. So, asset mapping. We're going to talk about, what asset mapping is and some tactical practices to actually do asset mapping locally in your communities. But I think it might be useful first to talk about the deeper value of asset mapping, and that's to take a step back before getting into the action of asset mapping and talk about this framework or this approach that informs asset mapping, which is something that we call asset framing. Asset framing is an approach to gathering information about a community that really is the opposite of what we would typically call a deficit-based approach. For instance, an asset framing approach is an approach in which you as local governments or you as local practitioners and looking to learn more about your community are really highlighting the best practices and the values that already exist in a community. So rather than figuring out what is wrong with the community or defining problems that are there to be fixed, which we would call a deficit-based approach. Asset framing is really an approach that seeks to uplift all of those good things that are already in our communities. So it's really it's a mind shift in how we go out into communities and how we think about communities when making longer term plans for them. So asset framing is an approach. It's really like a conversation with the community. This is heavily based in community development. It's a conversation with community members and practitioners to help them define their goals, and it helps them think about the structural part of what's missing. It's an approach because it identifies the values and the opportunities of community rather than highlighting the deficits or the barriers. So I'm going to pause and highlight this video from a member of our community, Trevion Shorters, who can describe what asset framing looks like for him locally. So I'll just pause.
The thing about philanthropy is whether we mean to or not, we have a very negative message towards the people that we say we want to help. I don't run around believing I'm an at-risk this or a low-income that or a high poverty, high crime. Like, no one carries around those labels thinking that's how I'm going to face the world, right? Because I know it's not intentional. But the thing about having a stigmatizing narrative in terms of the way you relate to a person is it automatically sets them in a place where they are being denigrated for the most part. Intentional or not doesn't matter, you know. They're being denigrated. A friend of mine used to say, if I'm crossing the street and you see me and you run me down with your car because you hate me, that's terrible. But if I'm crossing the street and you're not even paying attention and you run me down with your car, it doesn't make much difference to me. So the fact that you didn't mean to do it is irrelevant to my experience. Start off recognizing that people had aspirations before you showed up. Start off recognizing that people had value before you showed up. Tap into that value, and as much as you're willing to engage with them that way, they'll be willing to engage with you that way. And now we can build together.
So spoken eloquently, I think, by Trevion Shorters. And I think the big takeaway that I get whenever I watch this video is that it's the intention that matters before even beginning the approach of asset mapping.
The thing about philanthropy.
So to get into the topic of our webinar today, an asset mapping overview, let's describe what exactly asset mapping is. Asset mapping is a process, as Sam described in her intro, that uplifts the existing assets and highlights of a community rather than looking at what is wrong with a community or defining problems that are there to be fixed. Asset mapping, therefore, is a process that involves going and talking with community members, talking with practitioners, and gathering information about existing programs, about existing services that a organization may offer that in this case are related specifically to digital equity and inclusion. This will result usually in a long list that we would call an asset inventory. So maybe this takes the shape of a spreadsheet. And Aaron, in his part of the presentation, will be sharing an example of an asset inventory template for you to get an idea of what this will eventually look like. But all of which is to say is that asset mapping is more than just a list of organizations and programs. It is this active community-based approach that not only builds relationships with folks on the ground who are doing this work, but it also gives you the information necessary that will inform the rest of your the digital equity portions of your plans. You're gathering a list of information to help you really map out who is doing what in your community, who is working with particular community members that you may want to focus on in your connectivity plans, and who are the organizations or individuals that are best suited to deliver these services as a part of your connectivity plans. So all of this is based in this asset framing concept. Some more information about asset mapping, and this is really like the value of asset mapping. So, you know, rather than focusing on the needs or the problems of a community, it focuses on the opportunities and aspirations rather than problems to be fixed. You know, rather than redesigning or repurposing programs to fit a community, sort of helicoptering in and telling community members what works best for them. It builds upon the existing assets and, in a lot of cases, existing programs that communities have already developed. Rather than bringing in new or unfamiliar resources, or maybe, again, pigeonholing programs and resources to fit a community, it can foster new partnerships and create and engender creative solutions for some of the existing issues in a community. So some additional benefits of asset mapping, again, as I mentioned, the process of asset mapping, given that it is an ongoing conversation with community members, this builds that relationship, it builds that trust with community members. In a lot of cases, these may be historically marginalized community members who may have some distrust of programs coming in to, to solve for problems there. But this conversation, beginning with asset mapping, helps establish that basis of trust. On your end, as the information gatherer and as the data collector, it helps you, it's a framework to help you research existing programs or organizations in your community that are already doing relevant work. And then that leads to finding partnerships for programming to further extend your outreach and better understand your community. So some of the more practical advice that we would give for asset mapping, and again, Aaron will have an example that he'll run through in his section of the webinar today. But it goes without saying, start as early as possible. Asset mapping informs all of the aspects of your digital inclusion strategy. So community engagement, data collection, implementation partners. What we mean by that is that this list, this inventory that you will have gathered from through the asset mapping process, again, will give you that roadmap to help you decide who or which organizations are best suited to activate when implementing parts of your digital digital equity strategy as a part of your connectivity plan. The asset mapping process informs the rest of your broadband connectivity plan. So you're having this list of organizations and you're figuring out who does what and who does what best. Asset mapping is a process that takes time. This is an ongoing iterative process. It's not a static process, but it's also a long process. It will directly guide and impact your work. As I mentioned before, the asset mapping process results in the creation of something that we call an asset inventory, which is a list. This process does not end, rather it's an evolving process, and you will more than likely uncover more community assets as you continue to move forward, continue pulling on that thread and learning more about your community. It's interesting to note that organizations that maybe in the early stage of your process, you might not have considered relevant to doing, in this case, digital equity work, may have some ties in the community that you might not have considered towards the beginning. So this is an ongoing process. And finally, I think this is my favorite part of the asset mapping process, is that given that it's an ongoing conversation with community members and practitioners on the ground who are doing the work, it becomes a product of the community itself that is guided by you as you are gathering all this information and delivering these your connectivity plans. So in order to continue being representative of the people and the places that your connectivity plans seek to serve, the asset mapping process can and should have to evolve. This is a good thing, right? You'll want to continue adapting to changing needs and changing opinions in your community. So some additional best practices for asset mapping. There are some questions that you'll want to ask yourself, and this gets more into some of the practical tools that you might be using when undergoing the asset mapping process. The first question is, what information will be collected? In other words, and for us focusing on the digital equity portion of your connectivity plans, what information will be collected? You'll want to be asking yourselves questions like, who delivers digital inclusion related programs in my community? For instance, are there computer classes at the local library? Does the senior center have free public Wi-Fi or perhaps computer terminals that are available for the public to use. These are the sorts of questions, building upon the Digital Inclusion 101 webinar we did a few weeks ago. These are the sort of questions that you'll want to ask. What type of information is going to be the most relevant to your eventual asset inventory product? Secondly, you'll want to ask, how will I go about doing data collection? So another way of asking this is, what shape will my data collection tool look like? Is this a survey? Is this, in some communities, is this a paper survey that is distributed to community anchor institutions like a school or a library in order to gather relevant information? Is this a form that lives on a government website or on local partners' website, a portal through which you can gather information about organizations and practitioners doing digital inclusion locally? Getting to the third bullet point, what are my limits? Again, asset mapping can and should be an iterative, ongoing process. This is a good thing, but it can also balloon out in some maybe unsavory ways, because personally, when seeking to learn about a community, like, I want to know everything. But for the purposes of this exercise, asset mapping, we'll want to limit our scope to digital equity and digital inclusion related organizations and programs. And then finally, how will the information be managed and used? Another way of asking this is, who will manage the information and how will it be used, right? So who is the appropriate partner, or maybe in some cases individual, who has the data know-how and the information organization know-how to keep track of the eventual asset inventory that you'll be collecting? Who will be the person who can distribute and share insights from the information that you'll be gathering? These are questions that you'll want to ask, as well as, how will the data be analyzed and how will the product be shared? And I'm going to get to the product here on the next few slides. So after having asked yourself these questions around asset mapping, I think it might be useful to share some examples of some asset mapping products, right? So if asset mapping is the process of going out and engaging a community, gathering information about existing programming that are related to digital equity, that results in a list or a repository that we'll call an asset inventory. The question then becomes, okay, what do I do with this information, right? What is the best use of all of this information that I will have gathered? And having done a few versions of this presentation before, I think it's useful to look through some specific outcomes or outputs from the asset mapping process. So I'll just highlight a few on the next few slides here, and then I have queued up these websites live, and we can just do a short little website demo to give you an idea of what all of this is for, right? So what can, or what have other folks done as a result of the asset mapping process? So one that I'll highlight is the Capital Region, Sacramento, California. Sacramento partnered with an organization called MODAT, and they went through the asset mapping process. They went through the digital inclusion asset mapping process, gathered information about who's doing what locally, who are the best programs equipped to deliver digital inclusion or to provide discrete services to members of their community, and they built a website, capitalregion.modat.org. So I'm going to go through some highlights on that website in a bit, but then the other one that I'm going to highlight is the Portland Digital Inclusion Network. This was spearheaded by the Portland Digital Inclusion Coalition. So through their coalition network, the members of the coalition gathered relevant information about digital equity in the Portland area. And I think that there's also two or three locations on this map that are also in Salem, Oregon. So in some cases, they went outside of Portland city limits, but the idea and the spirit was the same, right? They asked, their primary guiding question was, who is doing relevant digital inclusion work in our city or region? And then how can we organize this? How can we organize this information into something that's usable not only for not only internally, not only for members of an internal steering committee or a coalition, but how can we make this information useful for the general public? So Portland, just like Sacramento, made a public website. So to give you an idea of, what asset mapping can result in, right? These are just two examples of what folks have done as a result of the asset mapping process. Here are two websites, right? But this isn't the only thing that one could do with all of this information. So again, this is Capital Region, Sacramento, California, searchable interactive website. There are two ways to sort of to browse this website, one of which is to use this search bar, use these filters, imagining that this is a public user, maybe like a resident of Sacramento, and they want some access to digital inclusion services. If they don't really know what digital inclusion services are, then usefully, the website has organized these 5 different highlight topics. So, and these are all elements of digital inclusion, right? So computers and internet training, digital services, internet access, and digital tools. So if I were a resident of Sacramento and I was interested in internet training, right, then I could just, if I knew about this website, starting there, use this website, figure out who is teaching classes locally in Sacramento. And when this loads, this will show me a map of Sacramento with dots for different organizations and different programs across the city, right? With more information if I were to click through, in this case, for the Greater Sacramento Urban League Job Center. So thinking back into asset mapping and how one would have gotten to a product like this, then this Sacramento would have had to engage local organizations and individuals, ask them what types of programs they're offering that are specifically related to digital equity and digital inclusion, gather that information on maybe a spreadsheet, maybe something else, maybe a long list, and an inventory. And you can see here, there's no real GIS expertise required to get to this. This is a Google map with some places pinned on it. Portland does something similar. So the first thing that we see on the Portland, what they're calling this a directory. For the purposes of our conversation today, I'm referring to this as the asset mapping outcome, but they're calling this a directory, right? They have a bunch of information about services, organizations that do work related to digital equity. Similarly to Sacramento, they're organizing their information into discrete chunks that are elements of digital inclusion, right? So this makes it easier as a user to understand and also to navigate this website. So if I click on technology classes, for instance, and then if I apply my filters, then the map above is going to filter from 180 results to 23 results in the Portland area. So similarly, I can click on any of these pins here. There will be more information if I were to click through. In this case, this is the Multnomah County Library, the Central Library. If I click through here, then I will anticipate seeing information about some computer classes that the library offers. So all of this is just to give you an idea of the life cycle of the asset mapping process. It results in an asset inventory, essentially a long but always growing and iterative list. But I just wanted to close this first section of the webinar with giving you an idea of what you can do with this information. In these two examples, asset mapping has resulted in publicly available websites that are useful for the folks who made it as they plan and deliver digital equity strategies locally, but also for residents of these areas as well. So I will pause there and then send it over to my colleague Aaron to talk through some examples.
All right, thanks, Paolo. Bear with us for one moment while we switch screens. Okay, hopefully you are all seeing my screen now. I see a thumbs up. Thanks, Paolo. So what Paolo just shared was 2 examples of outputs and kind of some of the key considerations for how you get there. We want to dive into a little bit more detail now and make this a little bit more specific for digital inclusion. And I'm going to pause for a second and say, we are focused on asset mapping for digital inclusion. So for the digital equity portion of your community connectivity plan. That is not to say that asset mapping isn't super important for the broadband infrastructure part of your plan also. That is really critical. However, we strongly recommend keeping those 2 sets of data separate. And that's because asset mapping for digital inclusion tends to focus on organizations and programs. So you'll see in a moment, kind of the types of data we suggest collecting are really focused on organizations and programs. You probably saw that a little bit in the 2 examples we shared. Asset mapping for broadband infrastructure is very focused on physical infrastructure. So it's looking more at like tower locations and tall buildings, where there is existing fiber in the ground. It's just different data, so it becomes really hard to combine them into one data set. So both are equally important. Both will need to go into your community connectivity plan, but you don't hear us talking a lot about the infrastructure side just because it looks different. And frankly, there are some of the other TA providers. I'll call out Tom Reed and his team in particular, who are the experts on doing physical infrastructure mapping. So there will be more to come on that, but if you're wondering, why are we only talking about the digital inclusion side, that's why. So with that aside, I will jump more into some recommendations that we have learned kind of from our experience and the experience of our community in how to go about doing asset mapping for digital inclusion. So we like to use, I love this graphic. We like to use this graphic in what we call kind of a concentric rings approach. So I know it can be intimidating to look at the work that has been published by large communities like Sacramento, like Portland, to see this very polished kind of website that's up and going with lots, hundreds of resources. That's a lot to consider. I will say the Sacramento version is a software as a service, so you don't have to know how to build a website. That MODAT tool is a software as a service that you can subscribe to and basically plug information into. So there are options out there that require a little bit less, let's say, tech savvy or capacity to build web resources. But still, it's a lot. Those are finished products. Those are the end result. But figuring out where to start can be a little intimidating. So that's what I'm going to focus on here for the next few minutes. So this concentric rings approach takes kind of an iterative process that follows 4 steps. So we suggest starting in the middle. And if there are any digital inclusion organizations in your community, it seems obvious, but start with those, right? So those might be if you have a nonprofit device refurbisher who is either based in your community or doing work in your community. If there are digital inclusion coalitions, or I know there are broadband action teams working in some communities. If there are organizations that exist for the purpose of doing digital inclusion work, that's core to their mission, start with them for a couple of reasons. One, they're the ones doing the work already, so that's obvious. You most likely know about them or will learn about them soon. And even more importantly, they're going to have a lot of other connections. They're going to know who else to talk to and be able to point you in the right direction. They'll be able to take a survey version of an asset mapping data collection tool and distribute that to other people. So they'll be a really strong resource. If you have community technology centers, again, these are all the obvious, but best places to start. So that second ring is organizations that may run digital inclusion programs, but that's not core to their mission. And this is actually, we're going to see a lot of your assets will fall into this second ring of the diagram. So this might be public libraries. We list senior and community centers. There may be a lot of different nonprofits that have like one digital inclusion program. So maybe it's like a youth technology program or a program that helps people sign up for the ACP or other discount internet programs. So they offer like one particular type of digital inclusion work, but that's not the sole kind of central part of their mission. So again, you'll probably see a lot of nonprofit and other organizations that fall into this realm where it's a part of their work. The third category that we kind of list here are organizations that can put you in touch with the communities that are most in need of digital inclusion services. So these are organizations that are already serving key priority populations. So public housing authorities, for example, prisoner reentry programs, ag extensions, universities are working with rural residents, lower income residents, farm owners and others. So these are the folks that already know and are already working with the people you want to serve through your digital inclusion portion of your plan. And they can put you in touch with those folks. So they may or may not actually be doing any digital inclusion work right now, but they can help you figure out the needs of the community that you're serving. They can help you uncover other assets that exist that will help you to serve those folks. And you might find out that they actually are doing a lot of digital inclusion work. They just don't call it that. So, the example I give is you may go talk to a social worker who's like, yeah, we don't really do any digital inclusion work. Well, I do actually help. I had to help some of my clients sign up for email addresses because that was the only way they could access services. And you quickly realize like, oh, we are doing digital inclusion work. We just don't call it that. It's just part of our day-to-day work. And so identifying and roping in those folks that are serving key populations already is really critical. And then the last category is the one where we encourage you to get a little creative. So think about what other assets in your community exist that could be brought to bear to help implement strategies to help bring people to the table, to help identify key and engage with key target populations. So we list anchor institutions, whether that's schools, hospitals, libraries, community foundations, universities, lots of different anchor institutions. Work with your ISPs. So they may or may not be engaged in digital inclusion work, but they have a vested interest in people using technology. These other assets can also be physical spaces, so they can be gathering spaces. So where do people already get together? Rather than having to go out and find people, go to where they are. So a lot of times this is places of worship. I've done city planning projects where the community gathering space is a person's front porch, and that becomes one of the strongest assets that we could leverage was go to where people are already getting together to talk about things. And then leverage your policymakers. So they may not see this as a priority issue. They may not be engaged yet, but the sooner that they become involved and understand this, the better they can become assets to you in your work. A few other recommendations as you think about setting up your asset mapping work and engaging in this. Using standard data fields and terminology is really important. We'll get back to that in a moment. You want to comprehensively think about all aspects of digital inclusion work. So what we mean by that is think about internet affordability and access, think about device access, think about the skills necessary to take advantage of those resources, as well as ongoing technical support, applications, and all of the other resources connected with using technology in an effective way. That said, it's also important to kind of maintain flexibility. So you don't need to collect all information about every asset. So in some cases, you may just need to know where is this location and when do people meet there, if it's a gathering space. If it's an organization that runs a lot of different programs around digital inclusion or that might be related to digital inclusion, then you might need to collect more information. So you'll want to be flexible and you'll want to get as much or as little information as you need. So there's no exact right or wrong way to do this, and there's no prescribed prescription that you have to fill out all information about every organization. And when we show you our tools in a second, you'll know why we say that. And then similar to the examples from Sacramento and Portland, we strongly encourage you to think about how to make the information that you collect in this asset mapping process free and accessible to as many people in the community as possible. So not only will it inform your planning work, but it can become a resource in and of itself to help people access digital inclusion resources. So those two inventories are great examples of that. They do not need to be as high tech as those. If you have a spreadsheet that you can put on a website and make available that people can look and see, who's offering computer classes or where could I get a cheap device? It can be as simple as you need it to be, as simple as your capacity allows. but making it free and accessible to people makes this process you're going through and this effort you're going through that much more valuable. Just a couple of other notes. Like I said, we strongly encourage standardizing data so that it can be aggregated. We would also encourage you not to take this on yourself. So think about, you may start with a spreadsheet and start collecting information, but that's a lot to do on your own. So think about partners that you can either share that spreadsheet with that can also help input information. Even better, create a template survey, which I'll show you a version that we have provided that's freely available to all of you as a way to crowdsource this. So get information out there, allow organizations to input their own information, and allow them to share a survey or other data collection tool with other partners in the community so that you're getting input from a lot of different sources. But that's why standardizing becomes important, because if you're getting input from a lot of different sources, you need to be able to aggregate it all back into one resource so you can leverage it and take advantage of it. So those are some key considerations as you're engaging in this process. And to help with that, we've developed a few tools. So I'm going to highlight these briefly. I'll do a very quick demo just so you can kind of see what they look like. And then we're going to encourage you all to start to engage with them also. We'll add this link at the bottom. This is to the NDIA asset mapping webpage where we have these resources. So the spreadsheet, which you see on the left-hand side of your screen, is available both as a Google Doc and an Excel version. And then on the right-hand side of your screen is a digital inclusion asset survey template. So the way these are set up is they both collect the exact same information, the exact same fields. So if you were to use the survey and either embed that in a website or send that out as a link in an email, if anyone fills out that survey, it's going to give you information that you could drop directly into the spreadsheet version of the inventory. And then you could also add your own information or add information that you know about other organizations directly into the spreadsheet. So in that way, it makes it easy to pull all the information together into one resource. In addition to these templates on our page, we also have some of the best practices and guidance. So some of the graphics and best practice examples that we're sharing here will look familiar because they're also on our page. And just some other resources and useful information about asset mapping is all available there. So feel free to take a look at that. Feel free to follow up with us with questions, and definitely in upcoming office hours in future weeks to pick our brains as you dig into this, get a little more familiar, and have some time to develop some questions. We'll be happy to work with you on that. So let's just quickly do a quick overview of what is in these tools. So we break down the inventory into a few different categories. So first, we have basic information about organizations. So this is, what's the address, what's the contact information. If you wanted to make this a public resource, it might be useful to know what days are they open and what hours are they open. Do they serve certain target populations? That kind of basic information about an organization or a program. And then we have 5 categories specific to digital inclusion. And you can use as many or as few of these are as relevant for any given asset. So, if someone provides broadband access or support for broadband affordability, you could fill out just that category, and there are some fields about that. If there's a device refurbisher or a device provider, you could use that second category about device access. If an organization or a program provides device access and also does digital skills training, then you could also use that third category about digital skills and tech support, and so on. So you can kind of see in just a moment here how that's broken down, how we have it organized. And again, we encourage you to use as much or as little as is relevant for your work and for a given asset that you're collecting information about. We also provide a handy dandy data dictionary. I strongly suggest starting there. So the data dictionary will list every field and every category in the asset inventory. It will define what we mean by a field. It'll also give you, in a lot of cases, some guidance and helpful hints for how to collect information. And for those of you that are data folks, it also has the field format, so it'll give you some specifics on what type of information and the format to collect that information. And so now let's start to look at the actual templates themselves. So the one that I showed on the left-hand side, the inventory, is basically just a big spreadsheet. That's all it is. And the way it's set up is you collect, each row is an asset. So an asset could be an organization, an asset could be a program. It's up to you. It depends on what level of information you need. But basically, we have information in 3 different formats. So you could have a free text field. So you see that in the middle, like, someone's contact name, email address, just text you type in. There's also single value drop downs. So for example, like state or territory, you just choose from the drop down list. And then there's also multi-value options where you can choose more than one value, like days of operation. You can, select as many days as you need. And where there are multiple values you can select, you'll note in our template, those are the fields that have a white background and colored text. All the fields that have colored background and white text are either a single dropdown or a free text field, but the ones with the white background indicate that you can select multiple values for that. And this is kind of what that looks like. So we have also color-coded the categories. So when you see things change from teal to red, that means you're in a new category. It's just a way to kind of help you navigate and make it a little bit more manageable. And if you see sometimes in the Google Sheets version, a little red arrow like that pops up, that's because it gets a little bit mad at some of the coding that we've built into it, but you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick demo just to show you what this actually looks like. So I'm going to pull up a version of our asset inventory. This is the same template that you can access from our site. If you click the Excel version, it'll just bring up a download screen. You can download it. If you bring up the Google Sheets version, it will prompt you to make a copy, and you can just make a copy, and that becomes entirely your own. So you are not feeding information into anything at NDIA. We don't manage this. We don't own any of your data. It will create a local copy for you that is entirely yours and free for you to manage. Again, we're happy to provide input and guidance and help, but this is entirely your data, your information. So in this example, I've just filled in 4 organizations from here in Portland, where I live. The first is Free Geek. They're a device refurbisher. They provide devices. They do digital skills training. They do a lot of different digital inclusion services. So they would be one of those organizations at the center of that concentric ring where they are a digital inclusion organization. That's why they exist. And for them, I started to fill out, this basic program information is category 1. So it's in teal here. So organization name. They do a lot, so I'm not going to try to capture every single program. I just kind of want their general information for now. So we've got org name. We're going to say they're a nonprofit. I can pick from this drop-down list of different organization types. You can, of course, customize that if you want, but we've listed a lot there. Again, feel free to use whatever of these fields are useful or not. I put in their website and where they're located, their physical address. It's helpful for me to know that they serve the Portland metro area. I've got some contact info, and because maybe I do want to put this on a map, similar to what Paolo showed, I want to be able to tell people which days of the week they're open. So they're open, I made this up, but they're open these days of the week. And then I also listed hours. And I know they offer support services in Spanish in addition to English, so you can choose whichever other languages. And let's say I'm just going to give a quick demo here of how to select multiple values. So let's say they serve multiple different target populations. So we know that they serve low-income households. So I would select that. And if I want to pick another value in our template, I just click it again and I pick another one. So I know that they also serve immigrants and refugees. And if I do that, I can keep adding as many of these as I want. They also serve people with disabilities. And I can just do this for as many of the values as I want. I know they also serve older adults, and so on and so forth. We can keep adding, as many as we want. And so I won't keep going through all the different fields. That's what the data dictionary down here is for. It'll tell you what they all are and give some more information. But as I scroll over, you can see now we've switched categories. So we are now in the, this is the broadband access and affordability category. So in this case, let's say they don't actually do any work in this category. So I'm just going to skip it all together. And I'm going to move into the device access category because they are a device refurbisher. And so I know they provide refurbished devices. They're also a distribution point where I know that that's where I would go to get a device. And they're also a donation source. So if I have a extra laptop I want to donate, that's a place I can go to donate. Again, I won't go through all these different fields, but there's a whole bunch of different fields. You can enter lots of different information about device access. Same thing for digital skills because they do digital skills training. I can capture lots of information about the types of training they offer, the types of tech support they offer, and so on. So went through that. I'm going to scroll all the way back over to the beginning and I won't go through this for all of them, but just kind of show at a different level. I know at the state level, the Oregon Employment Department has a specific program on workforce development where they retrain people and build in tech skills and providing internet access and a device as part of that workforce retraining. So here's a little bit of information about that, the program website. And again, I could go through here and fill in only the information that's necessary. So I know they provide a subsidy for internet. So I'm in the internet access category and they provide up to $100 subsidy at no cost to the participant. And so on. They also provide devices, so I can enter some information there, so on and so forth. So I did this for a few. You can kind of see, you know, I'm only using the fields that I think are necessary and the most important for what I want to show. But it kind of captures everything comprehensively and allows me to select which information I want to input. So that's a quick intro to the tools that we have available. You just got the demo, so I'll skip that. And now what we want to encourage you all, we've got about 7 minutes left before we wrap. So I'm going to encourage folks to, let's spend like maybe just 1 or 2 minutes and encourage you all to think about like, is there 1 or 2 organizations in your community that you would start with? So feel free to just put in the chat, you know, maybe like the first organization that comes to mind that you would approach to either enter information about or who you might reach out to as like the first partner to help you collect this asset information, keeping in mind that you want this to be kind of a snowball approach where you engage partners, ask them for their information, and then say, hey, can you send this out to other partners that you know of? Who else should we include in this asset inventory? So I'll pause here for just a moment. If anybody wants to enter 1 or 2 ideas into the chat about who might be the first couple entries into your asset inventory. And if you have other questions, if there's anything that came up throughout the rest of the conversation, please feel free to put those into the Q&A also. All right, I see Gregory, the Pennsylvania Broadband Authority. Absolutely. So that's one of those, it might seem obvious, it might seem like the most low-hanging fruit, but that's the case for a reason. Start there. And that's a great example of starting at a statewide level. Your state broadband office is going to know a lot of organizations in your community and in your region already. So that's a great place to start. And quick hint, pro tip, your state broadband office was required to do asset mapping as part of their Digital Equity Act state digital equity plan. So they've already got a head start on this. Some states have published the results of that, some have not. But if you're in touch with your state broadband office, they may be very willing to share the results of their asset mapping work. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to do it. That by no means means that your asset mapping is done for your community, because they were doing it for the entire state. They will never get to that level of detail that you might need for your individual community. But it's going to be a great place to start, and they're going to know some of the folks that have done that work. So let's get 1 or 2 more. Any other ideas about who you might reach out to first? Absolutely, library system. Tri-County Community College, absolutely, yeah. Satellite campuses, especially in some of the Appalachian areas. I mentioned it before, but ag extension offices from your land grant universities, some of them are already doing great work in this space. Even if they're not, they're in all the counties throughout your state and are going to be a great point of contact. See also, yeah, that's great. 5 Point Center, a local nonprofit resource center. Yeah, those are all excellent. Any other ideas? Okay, well, hopefully that is starting to generate a few ideas, get some thoughts percolating. And we'd encourage you to use some of the examples that we gave in terms of like where to start, who to look at, and definitely take advantage of the tools that we have on our site. As I mentioned, Paolo and I will be on the upcoming open houses. Those are entirely your time to ask us questions, to pick our brains, to get more input. Let us know if you're having trouble. Let us know if you're running into any issues, either finding contacts, who to talk to, or using the tools themselves. We'll be happy to answer questions.